Wow, a very rich session, and meandering, but also very loaded. But I think also outlining maybe an even sharper conflict than other forms of meandering, and I will choose the stronger embodiment that this conflict takes, and there's based on Iris's presentation of iconoclasm versus iconographia, let's call it, rather than iconophilia, iconographia of sorts, because I think that could maybe help a little bit, like to navigate through the different presentations and to eventually go back to the initial question of like how do exhibitions eventually write history? Like what is the actual method that they employ to perform this act of writing and of embodiment? And it's highly relevant that you sort of like looked at an archive. I mean, it's almost like paradoxical in that way to even the existence of an archive on iconoclasm, and there's an almost a contradiction embedded there as well. But I think that the idea of iconoclasm is highly relevant for our times as well. We're going both through one iconoclastic moment in a particular part of the world, and we're, here in China, we're living in the reversal of that, a major reversal of a previous iconoclastic moment in the Cultural Revolution. So these are definitely features present in the overall cultural conditions of these regions. But again, you're going back to the exhibition itself, and through the method of the exhibition, it's very much based on documents, on the absence of documents and the presence of documents that ultimately document destruction and obliteration. And then Mariam's presentation also refers to an exhibition that is all about its obliteration, and it's all about at several levels, starting from a people that was obliterated, was pushed towards obliteration, on an exhibition that dealt with that obliteration, then that in itself was obliterated, employing a method that it's all about having its own specter of absence. So maybe the two of you would like to jump on this convoluted and meandering connection.
Well, there's a passage in Kevin Young's book, The Gray Album, which talks about reading for the shadows. When you work with archives, you need to read them for the shadows. And that's especially true when you are working from the position of being a people who was erased or subjugated or in some way forgotten by history or left out or left at the margins of history. And so when you are reading a history from which you have been omitted, you have to read it for what is not there, right? So that's the kind of practice that the exhibition making in Past Disquiet reflects. It's this kind of reading history for the shadows, for what is not there, and trying to reconstruct from the margins and from these absences some speculation about what was omitted. Yeah.
I would maybe go back to that notion of the iconoclasm. I think that iconoclasm and idolatry is very close. It's almost the same. I mean, the moment that you destroy an image is when it's so strong. Otherwise, you wouldn't destroy it. And also, Manuel Delgado is a scientific, is an anthropologist, with whom Pedro is working a lot, and he says that actually at the time when in Spain they destroyed the churches, the Catholic Church had already they so much theatralized the churches that they even made monsters of it themselves. So what they would destroy the iconoclasts would make monsters out of monsters. So that thing is, I guess, very important. And then for the documentation, the whole project is about the interpretation of documents, the rereading and giving it to make an own rereading of documents and to give this position also to the viewer. That's very important. And at the same time, there is a certain kind of iconoclast tendency, I would say, in Pedro's work, who really he works with so strong images, but he also always tries to not put them too much because that's so seductive. Sometimes, as a curator, that you think that's actually a pity. But for me, because you talk about the missing, it's interesting that when he takes the photograph of that destruction of something and he would name it, Georges Bataille, for example, then the definition about the first step to connect both would be an image of Georges Bataille, which is related to the image of destruction, but which you could not see. But he would describe it, and then you could make a reference, but you would see the one image, but the others you won't. So there is always this kind of presence, absence, translation, transmission.
There's a tension too, always between the text and the image, and there's something in that tension, there's a gap, that you have to bridge as a viewer in order to understand the relationships that he's setting up, because it's not an obvious relationship ever. Yeah.
I mean, in your show, in the show, where is to be? Where is it? I think an open question. But where is the act of writing to be found? Is it in the actual, almost conventional academic art historical reenactment of this lost exhibition? Is it in the exposure of destruction? Is it in the little gestures, like the hand that appears, that moves the document?
They very explicitly don't reenact the lost exhibition, because none of the works that were in the exhibition itself are in past disquiet.
But in the mere act of having an exhibition that refers to it, there's already an act of reenacting. Somehow present. So in its evocation,
it evokes the exhibition, but what it really evokes more than anything else are these networks of solidarity and this whole universe of connections between artist associations and unions and parties and activist groups that made these kinds of exhibitions possible. So in a way, it's evoking a lost moment of international networks of artist activism more than it's even evoking this specific exhibition. The exhibition is like an entry point, to use your term, into that historical moment when these kinds of exhibitions were possible. And that's really what I would say 75% of Past Disquiet is actually about. A lot of the ephemera that you see is related to all of these networks. A lot of the videos that are in the show are also related to the networks. And then only some of the show is about the show specifically. And a lot of the stuff that's about the show is about the context of the show or the reverberations of the show, not the show itself, So it is really about the echoes and the networks. Yeah.
I would use this moment to jump to a question to Osei, because you know, both of your presentation, and I leave Simon out for now because I have another entry point question to his presentation. But both of your presentations, you know, dealt with, I mean, not only the process of writing history and the various ways in which exhibitions do that, but with actual moments in history, with moments that have passed, like both the moments of solidarity in a kind of post-colonial era, in a kind of non-aligned moment of hope, and, well, in your case, in the eternally playing out civil war in Spain that is, of course, never-ending and is somehow stuck in its own historicity. But then you also evoked, Osei, in your presentation, the 1973 Venice Biennial that was a response to the 1973 coup in Chile. But relevantly is the way in which that was referred to in Oqui's curatorial strategy, that it wasn't an act of reenactment, like curatorially, or even of documentary evocation or of archival evocation, but the main starting point was, the main strategy was to try in a way to reenact that spirit of solidarity, or to...
In a sense, but I have to also disagree, because when I was thinking about what the exhibition meant for me, I mean, you mentioned whether the beginning, is this on, can you all hear me? That the idea of an exhibition, it always has a paper trail, there are always these documents, and you're always beginning in a space of having to somehow navigate, even if it's the documents that come with the paperwork revolving around the objects that you select, no? Yeah. So you have this kind of immediate paper trail, and you think about, you know, the excavation of exhibitions that are happening as we speak will be that paper trail, and that will form that archive. So I don't think it's only connected to a certain kind of, although it often is a political solidarity, because through looking at the archive we can kind of identify inconsistencies and narratives that somehow don't feel consistent with many of the things we feel we know to be true about history. But in a sense, I mean, documents are, by extension of what they claim to be, I guess, kind of these objective things. And we don't often question them. I mean, even insofar as thinking about if you were to bring an object into an exhibition that said it was previously owned by Z person, you may assume that to be true because it's written in the document. That in itself is already a potential way into a fiction or a kind of misread history. That I think makes the Biennale interesting, because that was just Oqui's point of interest. But I think for most people involved, everybody had a different political tension. One of my critiques, in fact, of that particular structure of exhibition making is if you refer to a point in history that seems, you know, almost unequivocally righteous, like a moment which, of course, everybody wanted liberation movements and the unification of these states and communities, but that it's very easy to hark back to that moment without addressing how those reverberations are felt in the present, and the extent to which, you know, Venice reflected, as much as it kind of was able to reverberate, so many of the blatant inequalities, even insofar of its demography, speaking about the audience and publics who were able to access the political work that was being shown. And my feeling is that is always a very difficult space in which to deal, which is why I was kind of claiming at the end for the reconstitution of the local instead of this global huge project of thinking about everyone at once, which I think is impossible and also is too far-reaching for, I would argue, anyone. But
I would maybe just add that this questioning of documents, and because you were referring to this, is actually in Die Wandlung very interesting, because this is about the connection between these images melting the clocks, etc., and referring to this piece or this action from Joseph Beuys. And in the file, he's using all these press articles about that action, and this is very repetitive. But also you see, because for example, probably these writers, they were always rewriting the same sort of press note. But at a certain moment, the golden rabbit turned into a silver one somehow, and that's, I think, for him also very important to have this. And this always gets copy edited by curators, because they say, no, it's golden, but actually he refers to that problem of documents that they are actually telling different stories, different truths. No?
So Simon, so Piadasa is really a complicated figure.
I would like to believe so.
Yes. How can we use the, this apparatus here of iconoclasm versus iconographia to look at his practice and his persona in the overall cultural and political landscape of Malaysia over the decades? Because of course there is a tension between Piadasa of the 70s and his playful and speculative iconoclasm and general speculative Orientalism as well, and the more regimented participant in a writing of a national narrative of the 80s with the Malaysia series. So how does that shift happen, and how can we look at that at the Piadasa of the 1980s?
So well, I mean, what Piadasa did a lot in the 80s was that he also started doing a lot of exhibitions. But unfortunately, in my estimation, the exhibitions that he put together are actually quite conventional, sort of, historical, sort of, that sort of issues from very conventional sort of art historical kind of narrative that I don't find particularly interesting or challenging. And that's why I was perhaps trying to think of a way not to over-privilege the exhibition as a particular site in which to sort of think about this kind of radical sort of conceptual sort of departure in which he was trying to introduce, but using that term exhibitionary to sort of prospect how it could inflect perhaps other modes of thinking about notion of. I'm quite sort of taken by Pamela Lee's sort of this idea of the non-contemporaneity of contemporaneity. It's this notion of the non-parity. I mean, yesterday Brian and a few other people have sort of talked a lot about this over-determining sort of singular notion of time that we're all sort of caught up within. Perhaps trying to kind of recover instances of the past, or even in the recent present, or a recent past, of a refusal to sort of be singular, or be simultaneous even, or even be coeval, is maybe a project worth sort of visiting or revisiting.
Yes, but I guess that also shifted from sort of like his initial positions and then his ultimate decision of being part of a national project. And then I'm not recalling this exactly, but I think the Malaysia series started, or it was at least featured in an exhibition in the hallway of one of the national Congress meetings that was deciding on culture.
Which one? Entry points. Yeah, I think it was sort of imbricated in that sort of conversation about sort of the national cultural policy that came into being in 1971, which sort of really advocated to sort of forge a specifically local sort of narrative hinged on, say, Islamic values as central to sort of the nation building. But again, with entry points and specifically that work, he has chosen a Nanyang artist who is who's sort of bringing with them a cosmopolitan sort of immigrant culture that perhaps did not fit neatly into the parameter of what the nation state wanted. So in that work itself, I think that offered at least, if not a challenge, then at least a slippage from this this kind of project that was demanded of him that period. So that's probably something I'm quite interested in trying to figure out.
It would be interesting to look at, to try to force, to look together at these two classes of exhibitions in a way, that the kind of towards a mystical reality, and the class of exhibitions that were attempting to bring a certain international spirit into a local context, and to make that project of adaptation, and how did they relate to the internationalist exhibitions that occurred at the same time, and very often with the same artists featuring in both types and modes of exhibitions.
I mean, I think it's also important to say that I don't think you can talk about these extra-institutional solidarity networks as being everything all the time or everywhere all the time, you know, because very often they were people from a number of places converging to be in solidarity with a very specific struggle in a very specific place and time. And I think that's a different thing politically than trying to represent everything everywhere in one place, you know?
But its reconstitution as a restaged exhibition is that it, to some degree, because it's a way of reimagining, like you said, how all of those political forces would have aligned through some collective project, or that in that exhibition it's showing ephemera, collective archival material that brings it together. And I'm not disputing whether it's a useful way of thinking about exhibitions, writing history, because I think almost every example attests to that. But for me, it's this notion that I certainly feel when I visit archival exhibitions is a kind of forcing one's gaze towards that which we already know to be not true, but to not necessarily, and this is not reflecting on the exhibition you were talking about, which was totally interesting, but it's the notion of an archival exhibition that tries to deal with a moment of political radicality that almost is, it does nothing to shift the needle of our contemporaneity forward, which I don't know if that...
but I think, again, I think there's a slight problem there, because I think, you know, in Pas Disquiet, for example, those other museums in exile are evoked not to imagine a convergence of all museums in exile towards some gigantic single museum in exile, but because this particular international art exhibition for Palestine never became a museum in exile, so they're examples of something that never happened. And it's I think, again, it's about this distinction between the archive and the repertoire, because it can't be an archival exhibition in the strictest sense, because there was no archive of the exhibition. There were no documents, they were all destroyed.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying it's different from a common exhibition that would deal with the archival in relation to its political content. But I've just observed a certain kind of Groundhog Day situation when it comes to seeing archival exhibitions that deal with certain moments of movement and liberation as sort of struggle. So interestingly, I don't know. Which have nothing to do. I mean, Venice and Expo are so distant from that, and actually, it's interesting because they're not exhibitions that I could even see how one person could take on. That's why often they're produced by way of committee. But I think that they also, for me, signal a certain depth, because my fascination in work by artists like Marisa Merz and Mario Merz was those initial raw. Art of povera shows that didn't have sometimes an institutional context, often were not referred to as events. And now what we're seeing is kind of history being replayed before us with a very kind of modulated, extremely, it's sometimes choreographed form of exhibition making that is supposed to be all-seeing, all-knowing. And I don't think it does so much for our present times, but it's interesting because I also am not a huge advocate for contemporaneity being the only kind of soup, so to speak. But I think that the thing you mentioned about needing to look for other models that do feel more conceptual, for me right now is an urgent question that are maybe more artist generated even.
The
believe it or
73
not.
Biennale is actually a really fascinating model because it's a Biennale without walls. You know, they actually take the Biennale completely out of all of the traditional venues, and they stage it as a series of events and performances and public installations, and it's completely on the streets. So it really is very radical in its form as well as its content, and that's a fascinating thing to think about in terms of how can a Biennale be reimagined.
Where I would see more the connection between, I mean, with all the difference between the more archival exhibitions and the Venice Biennial is, and also if we talk about not only the rewriting of history, but keeping that open, this story, this idea that that there's a certain kind of overwhelming of material, so that there's no possibility. That was also very much the concept in Venice. There's no possibility to start at a certain point and to exit. So there are many entries, there are many exits, and so there's so as a visitor, I'm totally forced to produce a certain way of own navigation, and this I see a strong connection actually, even though the aesthetics are totally different.
I think it would be good to open it to the public if there are comments or questions. Diedrich was slightly first, and then we move the microphone upstairs.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and at least slightly, or maybe through a haze. But I remember that during those days of internationalism of that kind, and kind of coalitions and networks of solidarity, they were connected with a lot of battles, debates, and struggles. Like if you were a supporter of the PLO, or if you were in solidarity with the PLO, you were against the PFLP, or the other way around. And in all the countries that were involved in the solidarity movements, there were thousands of splinter groups competing with each other, and they were not in one movement at all, or they were maybe from a historical perspective, but it was very important for every gesture, every act in it, that you were fighting on so many different sides. And when I was like reading books on the Spanish Civil War, it was impossible to not know if the researchers were somehow in sympathy with the Trotskyists or the anarchists, which fraction of the anarchists, and which fraction, or they were even kind of Moscow-oriented supporters of the communists or whatever. So I mean, when you look at documents from either historical stage of looking at these historical events, I think it is this. The fact that those involved in different stages were so strongly positioned is somehow present in what you see in the documents. But it is very difficult, I think, to communicate. I don't even know if it's the idea to communicate that and when, my question would be in which way, to contemporary spectators. This kind of passion, fanaticism, of the period that produced this material. And I mean, in the case of iconoclasm in Spain, it's really the question, who was supporting it, where, in which, and in relation to which political group or political actor was in the Spanish Civil War.
Well, as far as I mean, if you see the images of that Pedro is choosing, I think it's very clear that some of them are dramatizing very much this act of destruction. What I didn't show then you have images where you really have, you see the anarchists sitting on a lot of liturgic material, and they are triumphing. So there is a very clear visual information in these images which show from which context it is coming. And also if you read the text, because the texts which are used in the files, you would have the description of the destruction of a sculpture which would read like a rape. I mean, so it's, if you follow all this material, you see very clearly that that it's not about the act itself, but the way it was used. And it's, as far as I understood, it's very unclear sometimes if the phalangists or the rights would have destroyed something to say later these were the anarchists, and the opposite, the way around. So that's actually the whole research of Pedro is around that.
Bing?
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I guess this is kind of like a comment or like an open question. Miriam, I was really interested when you were talking about, like I really appreciate that you were talking about like how to read history when you're a forgotten subject, and that kind of like compounded labor when you're reading histories. And I guess that brought me to Osei's mention of political antagonism and agitation and urgency. And it made me think about the necessity of permanence and durationality in the everyday and presence as well, and the different like registers of time and also space when you're talking about colonialism in the casual context with regards to the Black British artists. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that and the decolonial efforts that we need to engage in terms of like how it pervades our everyday.
You know, it's so nice to hear you say Black British artists in your accent, only because I say it often and people are increasingly talking about it as a kind of a point in history worth revisiting, only because if you observe much of all the world's futures, I'll just say this in brief, you have a great corpus of African American artists that really rise as euphoric, as being key in uploading information to the kind of post-colonial archive of contemporary art, and to a large extent work sort of really motivated by those questions, and have largely now, practices have expanded in all sorts of directions. But that kind of movement, that expansion of knowledge didn't really happen in the same way in Britain, obviously because there weren't the same historical tenets, but I'd also argue because there wasn't the same support system. London hasn't always been as international as it is now. Maybe it may seem that way looking at me, but it's not always been this way. And I think for so many artists, opportunities were scarce, but not only that, the opportunity to actually transmit and be effective within that local context of London in the 1980s during a time of riots is why you see practices like John O'Confer's having such a kind of guttural, strong, residual relationship to the archive and to history. But I've kind of lost your question because I got kind of joyous about what you were saying. But I was just going to say that the opportunity to bring that information into Milan Expo, which it's not something that they were considering, those artists. And in the end, the artists I mentioned didn't get selected for the show, but they were part of the catalogue, which meant a lot because I was saying in relation to what you said about permanence. I mean, when it comes to documentation of important exhibitions by African artists, and we had, Abdellah talk about his relationship to Benin, I question how often, these exhibitions that are being produced on the seeming periphery of contemporary art are really producing strong catalogues, archives, information that actually then holds its weight, whereas it seems that in other parts of the world there is this dearth of knowledge and information. And that's why I think biennales can be so problematic, because it's a lot of information being produced and knowledge being produced that then gets kind of sucked into an invisible vortex and onto the next one. So I'm kind of trying to figure out what we do with that information and how it becomes a kind of residual component of our future thinking,
Hamad.
Thank you for your presentations. I was actually just reflecting on the panel, the first panel yesterday, and trying to then link it to this panel today. So we're thinking about the economy of the exhibitions, and we're thinking about agency of history writing. And I was thinking about that link between the two. So in terms of who commissions it, and for what purpose. And I think, if you think about, say, the Venice Biennale, one of the things which was very obvious for anybody who visited and was critiqued was you could tell, what kind of a gallery was supporting what kind of a presentation. Even though, yes, there were certain artists that were represented in this Venice that weren't in previous ones. And similarly, in times of the, we had this example yesterday in Abdullah's presentation about the European Museum sort of largesse making certain kinds of practice possible. So thinking about, it's just the Palestinians' lost exhibition finds voice, however, but say the exhibition of the Western Sahara people doesn't. And I wonder, how we play with the agency of history writing itself.
I can say something about that. So Pas Disquiet was actually funded largely by AFAC, the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, rather than by MHKA. Especially the long-term research for it was funded almost entirely by AFAC. So the funding actually came out of the Middle East, not out of Europe, which is kind of an important distinction to make. It just happened to find its first space for exhibition, and its next two spaces for exhibition as well in Europe.
Which is also relevant.
Which is also very relevant. But if we want to talk about the economy of production of the exhibition, it actually is funded out of the Middle East itself. Do you want to speak about the Biennale funding?
I love the question of the economy. So.
Yeah, as an artist, I have lots to say about that.
I think it's so interesting you have lots to say, because I don't know why it wasn't mentioned in yesterday's talk on economy. It was kind of skirted over as a scary topic. I mean, to my knowledge, it's a known fact that these objects aren't moving on thin air. There are mechanisms of transportation, shipping, exchange, monetary and otherwise. And at least to my knowledge, especially when it comes to the work in All the World's Futures, I mean, that is not a good example of a commercial biennale, because there are unrepresented artists in that biennale. There are artists who don't have long-standing careers, but it seems that people want to focus on George Baselitz, or they want to focus on the work that seems the most reflective of a commercialized model. Well, when in actual fact, a lot of those artists were selected on the merits of their practice. I wish there was some kind of conspiracy. Their long forged relationships, many of those artists started working with the particular curator in question very early on, before they had those careers. And my feeling would be, even though we know that there's a wide funding, it's almost like that kind of Ivy League question of whether we know that certain people don't pay to get into the Ivy League. We know that. But we're also aware of the fact that there is a degree of meritocracy that means that they can admit students based on their qualifications and skills. And I think that when it's a strange analogy to make, and I'm going to finish it. Somehow, there's a need to think about a different sort of set of processes. I mean, at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of financial infrastructure for something like as large scale and monumental to exist. But maybe going back to the end of the point, the need for smaller models. Does an exhibition have to be so large? Did we need to see 133 artists and God knows how many artworks, most of which no one person saw everything? So what are we left with? I'm still trying to grasp that as someone who worked on it,
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe some people believe there's a conspiracy of commercialism in the selection of the Biennale. I think, for me, the question comes in more in the systems of display. So I think it definitely comes into play, not just in Venice, in all major periodic exhibitions. The question that comes into play is who can put extra money into the presentation of the work within the exhibition. And that's always very visible to anyone who knows how to look for it.
Yeah.
I mean, literally when I was at All the World's Futures, Coco Fusco's video wasn't even playing. I got up onto a bench to try and restart it, and there were so many footprints on the bench, so many other people had also tried to do it, you know, and no one had succeeded because it wasn't even like the video wasn't even installed to loop, so or auto start. So I mean, it was just like a nightmare, the video artist's ultimate nightmare, you know, where I was just like I wanted to like cry for her, you know, because I know her. And you know, there were other instances where there was just like there's clearly like a light shining directly onto a projection. There were things where like if there had been like $5,000 more, that wouldn't have happened. It was very, very clear. Like, so, you know, that is always present in these exhibitions.
But I'm going to make the dominance of specific practices insofar as telling a narrative. So in order to commission the work by Glenn Ligon, there was no other space to put that work other than above the door of the Giardini in order to invite people into that space. And those words being so kind of emblematic with a certain, almost kind of reminds me of the Harlem Renaissance. And you know, the exhibition stunk of jazz. I keep reminding people of this. And there are these kinds of ups and downs and these strange turns, but fundamentally, I think that more than most Venice Biennales I've seen, it actually dealt quite evenly with its distribution and display. Bias, maybe.
Well, Olivier is telling me that the coffee is getting cold of the coffee break. So also, we should not run out of questions and out of steam for tomorrow's plenary sessions, and I think it's the right moment to, well, reiterate and announce that, well, our plans for tomorrow, between 2 o'clock when we start and 6 o'clock when Diedrich will give us a lecture that I think is becoming a sort of a wrap-up reaction and digestion of our discussions here. So in those 2 hours, we'll be dividing the participants into 2 groups that will be announced later tonight, early in the morning. The speakers themselves will be announced. It was basically based on the presentations, together with the moderators, we will be proposing 2 groups and with a number of entry points to continue the discussion. So if there's any questions that you might be having now, keep them for tomorrow, and there will be plenty of chance to pose them. Unfortunately, yes, without Mariam. So the coffee break with the cold coffee now is the only occasion, and we will return here sharply at 5:10, no later than that. Thank you, everyone.